when we say a compass for the seeker of knowledge, we are not limiting that only to what we typically refer to as Islamic knowledge, but knowledge is something which Islam urges us to seek of every type of knowledge as long as that knowledge is beneficial knowledge. So the only type of knowledge which is dispraised in Islam and criticized are those things which bring no benefit, whether that benefit is to do with this life or the hereafter or both. Apart from that, we don't make a strong distinction between sacred knowledge versus secular knowledge. Insofar as everything which can bring benefit, we are supposed to learn and to guide and utilize for the sake of the betterment of humanity. Now, with that in mind, we have started by looking at what are classically called the Islamic sciences, by looking at how we approach the Quran, how we approach the Sunnah, and that was from the perspective of ourselves as ordinary Muslims. What is it that we can take from these areas of knowledge? How do we approach them? What are the priorities for us in studying the Quran, in studying the Sunnah? What are some of the misunderstandings or potential confusion or controversy that could arise, and how do we navigate through those? So this is the idea. Obviously, in the space of an hour or less than an hour, it is not possible to give a complete introduction to any one of these fields. Neither Quran nor Sunnah, nor what we are talking about today, which is Fiqh and Usul al-Fiqh. So I hope that you understand what we are trying to get through and what we are not trying to get through. And actually, the notes for this talk were originally delivered over a 2-day course in Edinburgh in 2012. So in one day we did pretty much the Islamic sciences, and that spilled over into the second day. And then we talked also about how do we approach and benefit from fields such as history, psychology, science, current affairs, and how as Muslims we are supposed to benefit from these and to navigate through them. And I noticed when I looked at my slides that I really wrote very little about fiqh and usul. Maybe I was feeling a bit prejudiced against fiqh and usul at that time. So for the purpose of this lecture, I've gone back and expanded a little bit on the slides. So first of all, what do we mean by fiqh? I think that you already know, otherwise you may not have come on the basis of the talk title. We're talking about what we translate as Islamic law, jurisprudence, and usul. Sometimes that is called jurisprudence or juristic methodology, legal methodology. There are different ways to translate these, but what it means is the practical rulings in Islam, and we're going to elaborate a little bit on what we mean by that. The word fiqh itself, in its basic Arabic meaning is understanding, but here it is used in a specific type of understanding. So, and this is a new slide, Islamic law fits within the broader rubric of the religion. And there are many things that are to do with fiqh that we would count as Islamic law, but that would not be considered law in the ordinary sense that people use the word, for example, in this country. So there are things which are halal and haram that have nothing to do with the law, such as this practice in the courts, and you wouldn't have lawyers dealing with that, but you have fuqaha or Islamic jurists who would deal with it. So when we say law, we have to realize there's a little bit of a, there's some nuance or distinction there to be made. Now, overall, we have the deen of Islam. Within the deen of Islam, we have beliefs, aqaid, and we have ethics and character, which is akhlaq, and we have rulings and law, which is called the shara'i', which is plural of sharia. So we have something called sharia. Sometimes when we talk about the sharia, we are talking about Islam as a whole is the sharia. That is one usage. But also sometimes when we say sharia, we mean in distinction to aqidah, belief, in distinction to akhlaq as well. Akhlaq meaning our ethics, our morals, our character, and all that element of Islam, the aspect of Islam, not an element but a dimension of Islam which is concerned with the inner aspects and striving for purification and so on. So law is not the whole of the religion, but also it is an essential part. And there are people who also want to try and get away from this idea that Islam is a legalistic religion. Islam contains law, and it contains much beside it. And law itself is not something to be scared of if we are looking for spirituality and ethics and morals, because our obedience to the law in the first place is a spiritual act. Because it stems from trust in the Creator who has made and formed us and who has revealed for us the best way to use our bodies, our minds, our souls, to direct ourselves to success in this life and the next. And Islam, its very essence, is submission. It is submission to the Creator. It is willful and loving submission. So, law and spirituality are not in conflict as some people may imagine, but it has never really been that way in Islamic history. I put a point here that when we talk about Islamic knowledge, usually it is fiqh that we think about first, especially when you talk about someone who is a scholar. The word scholar, being an English word, can be used and it has a lot of different meanings even in English. But when we talk about an alim in Arabic, usually our people are thinking about the faqih, the jurist. And Imam Ghazali even drew attention to this when he said that in the earliest times, people used to talk about the alim as someone who has knowledge of Allah and His attributes and the perfection of His creation. And then later on, it became more and more used for the faqih, the jurist, the alim of this aspect of Islam, which is the legalistic aspect of Islam. And I think that's the case nowadays. If someone is so-and-so an alim, we're not wondering, is he a mufassir or a muhaddith, or we're not asking about those things. Many other fields that a person can have knowledge in, let alone being an alim in chemistry, or being an alim in political science, this is ilm as well. But usually we are restricting it to this. So the faqih, the jurist, is a type of scholar who is extremely important in our religious life. The faqih is the one who is able to tell us what does Allah want from us in our worship, in our transactions. He is able to tell us that something is pleasing to Allah or displeasing to Allah in the field of halal and haram. And we're going to elaborate on this. That is a person who is a jurist. But there are ranks also. We hear the word mufti, we hear the word mujtahid. And these are ranks of scholars who are able to deliver fatwa, to derive rulings from their sources, and so on. So, as with the other topics that we're covering in this series, we want to look at what is it that we want to get out of approaching fiqh? What do we want to learn in fiqh? Maybe after this you will do a whole long course in fiqh, or you will read a book with a teacher, and you will go through a lot. But you have to know what it is that you are seeking. Otherwise, you're just spending your time day after day, week after week, and not sure whether you are actually reaching the goal or not. So, points of focus, what is most important for us? Number one, correctness in our worship, and with that also correctness in I've used the word transactions here. This is how normally we translate ibadat and mu'amalat. These are the two main branches in fiqh. Transactions is kind of a limited word. It sounds like we're talking only about financial transactions. Mu'amalat is any dealings with one another, which is everything apart from ibadat, which is acts of worship, rituals of worship, such as salah and saum and zakat and hajj. These are the ibadat and others. So we want to be correct, because Allah Azza wa Jal has placed us on this earth as a ground for testing. لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا, to test you as to see which of you is best in deeds. And Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad, may Allah have mercy on him, said that أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا, best in deeds, means two things. Number one, to be most correct, which of you is most correct in his deeds, and number two, which of you is most sincere in his deeds. These are the two pillars of any action: correctness and sincerity. Fiqh is concerned with the first one. Sincerity, we need another science, which inshallah we will talk about in another lecture. But both of these are Islamic knowledge. Both of these require knowledge. So correctness is very important. Otherwise, we could think that we are sincere and we're going through life performing all sorts of deeds. Some of them are haram. We are missing out things which are obligatory on us, and then we find out at the end that we have been doing things wrong, we have been missing things out, we've been missing out pillars of the deen, or we have performed those pillars but we have neglected pillars within that action, such as salah. We have to know what are the obligatory aspects of salah, what are the conditions and prerequisites before we can pray, what are those things that make the prayer acceptable in its form, as well as, of course, the other science which deals with what makes a salah acceptable in its spirit, what makes our worship true to Allah. The first one is fiqh. So knowing halal from haram, this is, we have here number 3 or number 2 if we count the first one as 1. Knowing halal from haram. There are knowing halal actions from haram actions. This is what we should recognize. I think I have added a slide after this. We're going to elaborate on this. Because in everything that we do, in different fields in our lives, there are going to be questions of, is this allowed, is this not allowed? So that might be, for example, if you take a book like Al-Halal wal-Haram fil Islam, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi has a book by this title, a very famous book, which is called The Lawful and Prohibited in Islam. If you look through the chapter headings, you will see all the different fields of life where halal and haram are relevant. Food and drink, clothing, home and work, marriage, social relations, recreation, and then it goes all the way up into international relations and all of these things, which is halal and which is haram. But after being correct, also we want to be able to share correct knowledge with others. And when we see that somebody is doing something wrong, we want to be able to correct them. And not only to say to them, what you're doing is different from what I know, which is not sufficient. Just because something is different from what you know, you yourself could be wrong, or both could in fact be right according to different opinions of the scholars. So if we are going to correct people, then we have to correct them correctly. That requires knowledge. This requires fiqh in this field. So a little more elaboration on halal and haram. And I had given a khutbah on this topic last week, I think, which was talking about different principles of halal and haram. As we've said, it is to do with the status of actions. Halal and haram is kind of a summary of two aspects. But any action that you do, it could have a number of grades. So as well as being haram, it could be disliked. If not prohibited, it might be disliked. And something which is disliked is still, in a sense, in the category of halal or mubah, permitted, in that it's not prohibited. But it's something which you are urged by the Sharia not to do. But if you did it, it's considered not to be in and of itself sinful. But then we have things which are not only just allowed, but they are more important than just being allowed. Some of them are obligatory. These are the things that are called wajib or fard. And it's important to know these different gradings because to understand the distinction between different actions and to understand the importance and priority, especially for those things which are fard, which are wajib, and then with that, or following on from that, those things which are recommended in Islam, which are mandub, or sometimes called sunnah or mustahab, different terminologies which have some distinctions between them, but this is not the place to elaborate on that. But also our actions can be graded in levels of priority. Even something which is wajib or fard, there are things which are particularly wajib and particularly important, such as the pillars of Islam. And in the haram, there are things which are forbidden, but there are things which are considered to be major sins. Some things which are the most destructive acts and habits. So even there is there are grades, and there are priorities. There are also different levels of clarity. The Prophet ﷺ has said, "Al-halalu bayyin wal-haramu bayyin, wa baynahuma umurun mushtabihat la ya'lamuha kathirun min al-nas." That the lawful is clear, the unlawful is clear, but between them there are what I'm going to translate as grey areas, doubtful matters, which not many people know. And this hadith is one of the very important hadiths in the religion. It tells us to avoid the doubtful matters and to refer to people of knowledge as well. Because if not many people know them, this implies that there are some people who know what those things which are grey areas, are they halal or haram. So by investigation one may be able to find out. But it is something praised in the deen to stay away from doubtful matters. Because if we follow the doubtful matters, we may be doing haram unknowingly. And even if we're not doing haram, just the attitude of following doubtful things will lead us eventually into the haram. So we have already pointed out the various fields that halal and haram deals with. And we know that this religion is comprehensive. But I also want to draw a note of caution that we should not always be using the language of halal and haram in all things, especially when we are not sure that it applies or how to apply it. And I have in mind, for example, there are various political disputes that take place. There are some things which are beyond political. When a ruler or a general or leader of a coup or whatever wants to spill the blood of innocent people in the streets, this is a matter of haram. It's not a question of political difference. But in some other things, vote for this candidate, don't vote for that candidate. We shouldn't say it is wajib to vote for this one and it is haram to vote for that one. Because most likely the matter is not as clear as that. But we should not misuse that language. We should use the kind of language that's going to be appropriate to the context. And there are many ways of saying that something is right and appropriate and a duty upon us without having to say that it's wajib or fard. Because then we are attributing something to the deen. And there are ways of saying something is inappropriate and should be avoided without saying it's haram, because then we're attributing it to the deen. And the way of the early scholars was always to avoid those words of certainty if they could. So when they were asked about something and they thought that this is haram, they would tend to say, I do not like this, I would avoid this, I advise you against that. Because even though they had knowledge, or perhaps because they had knowledge, they were cautious about asserting something where there was a role for difference of opinion potentially. So yes, halal and haram is comprehensive. But it's one of these words, especially haram, which some people shoot around, as soon as they see something, haram, or bid'ah, or let alone kufr and shirk. There are people who use these words very lightly. But these are all very heavy words. We have to weigh very carefully how we use them, when we use them, when it's appropriate. So there was recently some kind of talk in the public sphere about the haram police. People sometimes talk about the haram police. What they mean is, whenever somebody does an action, then people come along and say that's haram. So we don't want to have haram police. We also don't want to I don't know if this makes sense, but halal police. Those people who might believe that there's no such thing as haram and everything is halal. Obviously we have to keep things in balance. And this is where we want to say that there are important principles that we have to be aware of in understanding halal and haram. Halal and haram in Islam, the lawful and prohibited, is something which is intuitive. People of sound mind can recognize, yes, this must be halal and this must be haram, because it's in accordance with human nature, with sound human nature. And it is linked with benefits and harms. So those things which are beneficial to us have been made halal. Those things which are harmful to us have been made haram. We may know that harm, we may not know that harm. It may be revealed to us explicitly, we may be able to work it out, or we may never know until maybe in the next life it is explained to us what was the harm of something. But the role of the Prophet ﷺ was to make good things lawful and to make filthy things, harmful things, to make them unlawful. وَيُحِلُّ لَهُمُ الطَّيِّبَاتِ وَيُحَرِّمُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْخَبَائِثِ in Surah Al-A'raf. That this was his role. And there are things which may contain some benefit, but their harm outweighs it. The classic example of this is alcohol. As is mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah, that there may be some benefits that come, but the evil and the harm of it is greater. It is egalitarian, it's a fancy word to say, that all are equal before the law. And it is realistic. Because there may be cases of necessity, and these are mentioned explicitly in the Quran, where a person who is normally forbidden from eating certain types of foods, so meat that has been slaughtered improperly, or the flesh of swine, or alcohol itself, or blood, all of these things which are forbidden, but the exception is فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ. So whoever is forced to eat them because of starvation, potential starvation, and is able to stave off death by consuming a small amount according to necessity, then there is no sin on that person. So this is the realistic nature of Islamic law, and therefore this has to then be reflected, all of these things have to be reflected in the nature of Islamic fiqh. I had mentioned the word sharia before, and I had not explained the distinction between sharia and fiqh. And a lot of things could be said, but this is how I would put it. The sharia refers to the law as revealed in the Quran and Sunnah. In fact, the Quran itself and the Sunnah itself, together these can be termed the sharia. Sharia means the path towards water. And as such, the sharia is infallible, it is divine, it has complete authority. But fiqh, as Islamic jurisprudence, is the human effort to understand the sharia and to derive the rulings from it. And as such, fiqh, Islamic fiqh, there is scope for difference of opinion in it. And it is not divine, it is not infallible. It is only right insofar as it is in accordance with the evidence. Other important principles in halal and haram. The default is permissibility. Things in general are considered to be halal unless there is a proof which we find in the Quran or Sunnah or derived from those sources through the other methods which are authentically established by the scholars, if there is any evidence saying that something is haram. Now this statement should not be generalized to all cases, because in the first place, this is not true of acts of worship. Remember we said that we have ibadat and mu'amalat. So ibadat or acts of worship, in this, the opposite is true. Because we cannot say, if I want to add more rak'ahs onto dhuhr, for example, and I want to pray 6 rak'ahs, this should be allowed because there's no text prohibiting it. Maybe there is a text, but I'm saying on the assumption that there's no text, then someone might say, then it's permissible. But that's obviously not the case. Because in acts of worship, we have to receive them. And the Prophet ﷺ has said, pray as you have seen me praying. And all of the acts of worship, it is the case that things are haram unless there is a text or there is a proof to show that it's halal. But we should not then apply that principle onto everything else. And you see this sometimes when people are arguing, they say, show me the proof from the Quran or show me the hadith that says this is halal. Whereas in that case, it is supposed to be the other way around. It's halal unless there is something which proves that it's haram. So in that sense, the burden of proof is on the one who says it's haram. So that is the case in most of the mu'amalat. Of course, we may say there are other exceptions. So for example, some meat. If you found some meat and you don't know its origin, you would assume it to not be halal. Unless you know, through reasonable means, that it is halal, it has been slaughtered correctly. And finally, and very importantly, from the principles of halal and haram, is that it is Allah's right only. It is His right to legislate. It is His right to make things halal, and it is His right to make things haram. And both of these things need to be said because There are people who arrogate to themselves the right to make things halal, which Allah has forbidden. And there are those also who do the same to try to make things forbidden that Allah permitted. And both of these are wrong. And in a sense, they are shirk. Why? Because you are setting yourself in the position of the Godhead, of the legislator, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah Azza wa Jal also forbids and condemns those who seek to forbid what He has allowed. When He says, قُلْ مَنْ حَرَّمَ زِينَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي أَخْرَجَ لِعِبَادِهِ وَالطَّيِّبَاتِ مِنَ الرِّزْقِ. Who is it? Say, who is it who has forbidden the beautiful adornments that Allah has brought out for His servants and the good things of provision? Now, before we start to talk about the juicy topic, which I think some people probably were interested in from the publicity, which is difference of opinion and madhabs and things like this, we want to say that we want to look a little bit at what we have called Usul al-Fiqh. In the title we've talked about Islamic law, as we said, Fiqh, and also Usul al-Fiqh. Because in deriving rulings, the scholars don't simply obviously rely on guesswork, but they have to have a process. The evidence is not only the case of there's a text here, there's a verse in the Quran that says it explicitly, or there's not always a hadith which explains the rule explicitly, but there's a process by which the Quran is understood, the hadiths are understood, that the way that things are weighed up, the way that things are derived and investigated. There are rules that are based upon the Arabic language, that are based upon logic, and of course that are based upon the example and method received from the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba. So it is important to appreciate that in deriving rulings there is a very complex and sophisticated method or methods, all of which is studied in Usul al-Fiqh. So no one should imagine that they can just pick up a text, a translation of a verse or translation of hadith and start to derive rulings from there, because they have to go back to the methods of Usul al-Fiqh and to the opinions found within the fiqh tradition. So, evidence is behind rulings. When a person is learning the rulings, they know, for example, in Salah, I have to do this, then I have to do this. This is the ruling, this is wajib, this is sunnah, this is, all these different aspects of the prayer, for example. After learning that and appreciating that and implementing that, we should also always be seeking to climb up the ladder of knowledge by understanding something about the evidence behind that. Why is that so? How is that derived? Is it from a specific text in Quran and Sunnah, or is it using other methods? Because there are four main usul, or four main sources through which scholars derive rulings. After Quran and Sunnah, there's also something called ijma', which is the consensus of the scholars or the consensus of a generation like the Sahaba. And there's also something called qiyas, which is extrapolation or analogy from stated cases. Because there will be always new cases and new issues which come up. And one of the ways that scholars can answer the question, what is the ruling of this new issue? They can say, well, it is similar and shares a common core and common essence with this other thing, with this other case. They are bound by a common reasoning. Therefore, the ruling that applies to the first one should apply also to the second one. This is called qiyas. So there are other sources as well. And each of the madhabs or the schools of Islamic jurisprudence have got their own list of usul and how they emphasize one over the other. So this is something that has to be appreciated before we start talking about this madhab is stronger than that one, or this imam didn't understand hadith and didn't which people say wild statements like this all the time without realizing how they are how they are belittling their own selves first before belittling the great giants of Islamic scholarship. So we're still in a sense talking about what do we want to benefit from fiqh and how do we go beyond that. So we're benefiting from fiqh in correcting our worship and our dealings with people, knowing halal and haram. But then we want to go beyond those things to say, how do we understand the evidences behind the opinions that I follow, the evidence within my madhab if I'm following a madhab. Then there's also a branch of Islamic knowledge which is called the maqasid, or the higher purposes. And famously, Al-Imam al-Shatibi, rahmatullah alayh, has defined that there are 5 purposes or higher intents or objectives to which all rulings in the Sharia return. And that is protecting 5 things. Do we know what these 5 things are? Honor, yeah, or if that's linked also to family and the lineage, yeah, so it's described in both ways. Also, life, okay, human life, the soul, property, yeah, or wealth. What else? I'm going to point here, no, not here. Yeah, the intellect, the mind, and you've made me forget the 5th one. So we've said life, deen, we said wealth, lineage, and something very important, number 5. Not the heart. That would come under deen. Something very important, inshallah, we'll remember before the end. Okay, so these are described as the higher purposes or maqasid. And this is something which is quite popular to speak about these days. Sometimes people are misusing discussion of maqasid. This is not meant to cancel out the actual rulings in Islamic fiqh. You can't just say, well, this ruling has been, we should cancel it by looking at the higher purposes. These things have to go hand in hand and kept in balance. And the maqasid are a kind of guide for the scholars to be able to know and to derive the rulings correctly. But at the end of the day, they themselves are based on the individual rulings. So we can't use the rulings to figure out what are the higher purposes and then use the higher purposes to cancel out the individual rulings. Okay. Explaining wisdom, what I was getting at in this is something which we may not elaborate on, but sometimes we want to explain Islam to others, and we might talk about certain rulings. Why does Islam allow this? Why does it not allow that? When we are trying to explain these things, the first thing that we should look at is whether the Quran itself or the Sunnah itself provide an explanation. So for example, why do we fast? Why do we fast? The Quran says, fasting has been prescribed for you as it was prescribed for those before you, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, that you may gain taqwa. So the first and best answer that we can give for why do we fast is, if you like, because it is obedience to Allah, because Allah has commanded it. Number 2, we can say, in order to gain taqwa. Because that's not speculation, that is the explicit statement of the Quran. After that, if we find more benefits and explanations, and there are many and many explanations, then we can use them as long as they are not too speculative. But we can say, for example, that it is a training for the body, it is a freedom for the mind, it liberates us from our desires, it provides solidarity with the poor. These might be explanations, but we should not attach too much to explanations that we have reached with our own minds or with our own experience over the things that we have in the Quran. We should avoid arbitrary explanations. If you see why people say why pork is forbidden, they will tell you because it contains, the pigs are very dirty and they eat their own waste and all of these things. But the problem is that if you explain it in this way, someone can then say, what if I raise very clean pigs that are almost cleaner in their behavior than human beings or some human beings? Then is it allowed to eat those? No, it would never be allowed. What about zina? If we say because there will be there will be spread of, we won't know who is whose father and whose child. We'll say, well, now we have DNA testing, we have contraception. Does that make it allowed? No, it will never be allowed. So using speculative explanations could lead us into problems. This is the point that we're making. Right. So now we're coming to the question of difference of opinion in Islamic fiqh. And this, in fact, could be its own course or its own lecture, but I will try to give a summary of the topic as best I can in a short time. Difference or divergence, I've used the word here, is something which is natural, which is part of Allah's wisdom. He has created us with many differences between us in the way that we appear and our languages and our colors and our ways of thinking. And all of these things are in themselves something which are signs of Allah's creative power and His creative wisdom. So we should not be afraid that we are naturally different from each other in some ways. As a result of that, we will see difference of opinion between human beings, and we will see difference of opinion even between Muslims. Why? Number one, because Allah has decreed it that way. And number two, because if we look at even the texts of Quran and Sunnah, we will often find that there is a lot of room for interpretation of those texts. Even before the interpretation, the texts themselves, there could be difference. In a hadith, for example, has this hadith been, is it narrated authentically or is it weak? Can we use it or can we not use it? One scholar may say, this hadith is strong, so I will use it. Another scholar says, no, I disagree because of a certain narrator in there, in that chain, I consider it to be weak. So they can differ on that level. After agreeing on the text itself, they can differ on how they interpret the text. Then they can differ in the methodology. And that's what I was describing before, that there are different usul in each madhab. What they give emphasis to over what. And they can differ in how they understand the reality that they are talking about. Whether, for example, if something is prawn and shellfish and so on, are they fish or not fish? You see, those who said among the Hanafi scholars that they are not fish, they said that it's not allowed to eat them. But the majority of the scholars or those of the other schools says they are fish or they count as fish. So this is a matter that goes back to their understanding, you see, which may be objective understanding, may be subjective understanding. It may depend sometimes upon their scientific understanding of a particular time. So they can differ also when it comes to the application. And differing goes all the way back to the time of the Sahaba. Although they had the advantage that when they differed upon something, they could go back directly to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But we are commanded to do the same thing when the verse of Quran says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم. O you who believe, obey Allah and obey the Messenger and those with authority among you. So obey Allah and obey the Messenger, these are distinct types of obedience, and we talked about that in our lecture on the Sunnah. فَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَالرَّسُولِ. But if you should disagree on something, and this is again, it's a reality. The Quran is saying, if you should disagree, i.e. you will disagree, then take the matter back to Allah and the Messenger. And this means to the Quran and to the Sunnah. So the Sahaba, a very important aspect of the differences that occurred between them is an incident which we will mention, that after the battle of the Ahzab, after the battle of Khandaq, the Prophet ﷺ was commanded to take the fight over to Bani Qurayza, the fortress where a tribe of the Jews was residing, and that tribe had betrayed their treaty with the Muslims because they had been entrusted along with all the citizens of Medina to protect the city. But instead they allied themselves with the mushrikeen who were attacking Medina. So as such they had committed treason. And the Prophet ﷺ sent the Muslims forth to Bani Qurayza and said to them to make haste. So he said to them, لا يصلين أحدكم إلا في بني قريظة العصر. Don't any of you pray Asr except at Bani Qurayza. And this is a very important hadith, so I want us to pay attention because it will help us to navigate through some of the differences and to recognize that difference is not something which is a disaster in and of itself. So the Prophet ﷺ said, let none of you pray Asr except at Bani Qurayza. Now on their way, the sun was setting and it was about to become the time of Maghrib. And so the Sahaba started to wonder and to differ between themselves. Some of them said, the time of Asr is nearly finished, but we have been told, don't pray except the Bani Qurayza. So we will allow the time to pass, and then we will pray Asr there as qada. And this is the explicit instruction of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? You understand their point of view? I'm going to do a poll in a minute to see which one you agree with. Right? So the first group said, we will follow the exact letter of the Prophet's command. He said, don't pray Asr except the Bani Qurayza. So how can we pray Asr here on the way to Bani Qurayza? You're sympathetic to this view, I know. The second view, the other Sahaba said, no. What he was telling us was to hurry and let us not be late in getting there such that we would pass the time of Asr. So he was telling us to make haste. He was not telling us to miss the prayer. Now that the time is about to pass, we should pray and then we should make speed and get to Bani Qurayza. You understand their point of view? Okay. Who agrees with the first group who said that we will not pray until we get there, even if it's past the time? 2, 3. Be confident. You don't have a choice really. You have to either pray or not pray. We imagine that we're doing it now. Okay? You have to pray or not pray. So you are the ones who respect the words of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay. The other group, yeah, believe that the purpose was to just hurry. So you respect the spirit of the Prophet ﷺ command. Of course, all the Sahaba respected both of these things, but they had to make a choice. Now when they got there, of course, those who wanted to pray had prayed, and those who didn't. They went back to the Prophet ﷺ and asked him for his judgment. And the narrations of this do not tell us that he informed one group that they were right and the other that they were wrong. But rather, they tell us he did not rebuke either of them. He did not correct either of them. Now, can we assume that the Prophet ﷺ, when he said it, he did intend one of these meanings? We can assume that there was one correct answer, yes. But the Prophet ﷺ didn't tell one group that they were wrong, because both of them were following a good principle and a good intention and good fair method in reaching their conclusion. Some of those focused on the words and some of them focused on the intent. So these things have always been there. So we could say more about the companions, but we'll move on now to the tabi'een. It is well known that among the tabi'een there were those who were more described as the people of, or not so much the tabi'een, but that era and the era after it. There were those who became more known as the people of hadith, and there were those who were more known as the people of ra'i, of opinion. And this may be a very simplistic division, but this is the way that the history is described. That there were those who were more focused on the letter of the law, and there were those who were more focused on the trying to understand the reasoning behind it. And famously, the people of ra'i are the Hanafis and the people of Iraq. Okay, which is probably we are their inheritors on some level. Not very the best inheritors, but in the sense that it was the people of Ra'i who gave birth, eventually to what became the madhab of Abu Hanifa, rahmatullah alayh. So the jurist imams, these were those figures who gathered the fiqh from the earlier generations and who developed a school and a methodology and had people around them. So this is where we come to the issue of the madhabs. The first of those famous madhabs is that of Abu Hanifa in Iraq, and then there is the Imam Malik in Medina, and there is Imam Shafi'i who studied with Imam Malik and studied also with some of the students of Abu Hanifa, and he traveled between Iraq and Egypt. And then there is Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who was a student of Imam Shafi'i. So these are as it were, the founders of the 4 madhabs. Now there were not only 4 madhabs, but there were plenty of madhabs, plenty of schools of thought or schools of fiqh. When we call them schools of thought, I think that is a funny translation, because this is not fikr and thought. Okay, this is fiqh. This is schools of jurisprudence or schools of law. There were not only 4, but history has preserved these 4. So over the centuries, these 4 retained strength because they had followers and they had supporters, whereas there were other imams who established madhabs, but but they didn't last the test of time. But still, we can find that their knowledge still has its effect and its traces in the Islamic tradition. So after a time, it became the norm that people, when they were specialized in fiqh, when they were studying fiqh, they would learn fiqh according to the methodology of one of these four imams. And that remains the case until today. But there was also a time which could be described as a time of stagnation, where people had lost the spirit of those earliest imams in deriving fiqh, in looking at situations in a fresh way, and they contented themselves with repeating the rulings that were received from before, until it became the case that they said the gate of ijtihad is closed. There's no more room for reasoning. It's only allowed to repeat the rulings which are received from before. So this is what is described as stagnation, because it meant that, like in the early 20th century, before Einstein had brought his theories and so on, they actually were closing the patent offices. Patent offices where you register copyright for a new invention. Because there came a time when people in Europe thought that everything has been invented which could be invented. And this was before the 20th century, in which all technology has shot exponentially. But at a certain time they had thought everything has been invented. There's no need anymore to have a patent office. But obviously you can see how that was wrong. In a not dissimilar way, Islamic fiqh also has to respond to all the changes in the world. So to say that everything has been figured out centuries ago is obviously a very dangerous position to take. But that is the position that even till today there are scholars who assert something along these lines. So in the present day, there are efforts to revive Islamic fiqh within the madhabs, also outside the madhabs. There are attempts to synergize between different schools of thought, and there's something which in Al-Azhar we describe as comparative fiqh, which is studied as we study the opinions of all the madhabs, and scholars of the current times weigh up between them and say this is considered to be the strongest or this is the most appropriate to the situation that we're in, and scholars who are qualified enough to do so can do so. So this is to give you an idea of the history of differing. I'm not going to elaborate on all these points just because of time, but I'm trying to get across the point that having these differences between the scholars is not something to be sad about and to be upset about and to consider as a tragedy. Instead, we can try to appreciate the benefits of that, the positives of that. Yes, there is potential for negatives. Yes, we see that people have sometimes arguments between them and quarrel over things that they should not. There's rivalry between people according to different opinions. Team halal versus team haram on a certain issue. Yes, these are all problems which exist. And there have been periods of the worst type of fanaticism between followers of different madhabs. People who said, people of our madhab, the women of our madhab are not allowed to marry the men of that madhab. Which is obviously an acceptable level of fanaticism. But at the same time, there is so much benefit that can be derived from diversity. We use the word divergence and then difference, and now diversity is a more positive word, isn't it? Because Islam, being a universal deen, has to be applicable to all places and times. So the fact that we have different opinions that scholars of the current time can choose from our Islamic tradition, this provides a vitality to the deen. Facilitation, where people are in a particularly difficult situation, for example, living as minorities, for example, living in extreme north conditions, or living as a minority in extreme north, as we are, then there may be need for facilitation in certain things. So there, Islamic fiqh, where there are different opinions, then sometimes the easiest one can be sought in order to solve a problem that people are facing. Intellectual vitality, that we should have that spirit of debate and of seeking the truth, not just to have everything easily laid out on a plate, halal meat on a plate. Everything is easy, but there should be striving for truth. This is the vitality of this ummah, and from that also we can learn from one another. So this is the things that we want to say about the benefits. So let's get to the crux of the matter, Because after saying all that, I know that you're asking, so do I follow a madhab or do I not follow a madhab? And really, I didn't feel that my job is to stand here and tell anyone, do this or don't do that. But this is a point of view and a perspective that I hope will help. Number one, that the obligation upon any Muslim is to follow correct knowledge. Not to follow a particular scholar or a particular madhab. We cannot say by any means that Islam has mandated to follow the Hanafi madhab or to follow the Shafi'i madhab. It's impossible to claim this because Islam predates any madhab emerging, and Islam is broader and vaster than this kind of mentality or outlook. But what is necessary upon us is to ask the people of knowledge if we do not know something. If we don't know, we have to seek the knowledge. So that means asking people who know, and taking from people who know, and following people who know. So we should have teachers and we should have imams that we follow. Now, who are the best type of imam to follow? We're talking not about the imam of a mosque, just someone who is called imam, that you follow them in everything. Yes, for the ordinary people, typically, that's what people will do, and that is fine because they're following someone who has more knowledge than themselves. But in order to know really what is halal and haram, we have to go back eventually to the people who are able to derive those rulings correctly from their sources. And these are the people of ijtihad, these are the mujtahid scholars. And the greatest of the mujtahid scholars are those who were the founders of the four madhabs, and others in history. But the point is, you can do a lot worse, and you can do a lot worse than following one of the four madhabs. And what I'm suggesting is that it is a way of safety. It is a way of security in our deen to learn Islam or learn fiqh, to learn how to pray, for example, to learn the rules of zakat, to learn the different rules of Islam, halal and haram, to learn them upon a madhab. Because that is the way that is well established in Islamic history. That is a way that we can avoid certain problems which occur from mixing between different things. If we take a ruling from here and then another ruling from there, we might not realize that these two things are actually in contradiction to each other. So, by all means, someone who knows how to make the cocktail or mocktail, halal cocktail, we'll call it a hocktail, okay? Whoever knows how to make this in the best way, it will taste, amazing and beautiful. But if somebody mixes the wrong things, maybe what they make is toxic and poisonous. So, picking and mixing can lead to this kind of mistake if it's done by people who don't understand. So, can I say that someone is doing haram if they take from this school and that school? I cannot say that they're doing haram. But what we're suggesting is that as Muslims, we should want to be in the safest position. We should want to be progressing on a path. In order to progress in our knowledge of fiqh, we should learn one set of opinions from within a madhab or from a certain scholar. We learn those opinions and we learn the evidence behind those opinions, and that way we can climb up the ladder of Islamic fiqh. And we can start to compare with opinions in other madhabs. And if you find that after knowing the ruling is the evidence behind various rulings, that you find that the opinion in the other madhab is stronger than the opinion in your madhab, and you want to follow that other opinion, then no one can say that you have done something wrong. The matter is dependent upon knowledge. And the final point is that regardless of what opinion that we happen to take in a matter, we have to observe the etiquettes of disagreement. Again, this in itself is enough for a whole lecture at least. But basically, what we mean by the etiquettes of differing is to just recognize that people follow different opinions. If they are following qualified scholars and you are following qualified scholars, then there should be no reason to attack one another. But we can speak with one another, we can learn from one another, we can debate if we have the knowledge to debate. Otherwise, we should remain silent and use our time more effectively. But this is the kind of spirit that we should have, not a spirit of competition and rancor. As occurs, and now Ramadan is around the corner, we need to be busy with preparing ourselves for Ramadan, not arguing when does Ramadan start and what time should Fajr be and what should, these things we should leave to the scholars. We should take whatever is convincing to us. We should try to find out what is the strongest if we can find out. But we should not also waste our time arguing about things, that, mashallah, there are people who are specially employed to argue about these things. And just in conclusion, there are some readings here. I've suggested at the end of every lecture a few readings or things that we can follow up, in English in particular. So there's a book here by Sheikh Akram Nadwi, which is covering Islamic fiqh, especially the acts of worship and so on. It's now up to volume 2. Fiqh al-Sunnah, the famous book which is considered a book of comparative fiqh by a great Azhari scholar, Sheikh Sayyid Sabiq. A classical book along the same lines is Bidayat al-Mujtahid of Ibn Rushd. It's a more advanced text, but because it's available in English, I've mentioned it. Then the book which I mentioned, Lawful and Prohibited in Islam by Sheikh al-Qaradawi. There is a book called The Ethics of Disagreement in Islam, which is a really valuable read, and also this one is actually, you can find it and read it online. And an example of a book in Usul al-Fiqh here, Islamic Jurisprudence by Niyazi, and this is an example to give us an exposure to the methodology behind fiqh.